Okay, today I am reviewing Agatha Christie's The Murder in the Mews. It's a collection of 4 Poirot stories. The first story is the title story, Murder in the Mews. These are all extended stories, so they're going to be probably about 40 to 50 pages longer than your typical Christie story because there's only 4 in the collection. Now, the other 3 short stories in the collection include one called The Incredible Theft, a second story called Dead Man's Mirror, and then the final story in the collection is Triangle at Rhodes. These stories are quite a range of stories. 3 of them involve deaths, and one of them, of course, The Incredible Theft, is simply a theft and involves no murder. The first story, the title story, Murder in the Mews, and Mews, by the way, simply refers to basically a stable area that's been converted into flats, kind of like how we in the States would refer to carriage houses. It's sort of a row of carriage houses. In that story, as well as Dead Man's Mirror, we're looking at ideas of apparent suicide that might not be suicide, or murder that might not be murder. And so Christie's really kind of toying around with these issues in those 2 stories. The first one, Murder in the Mews, of those 2 stories, I think is a really nice, tight story. Christie has a little bit more time to play around with some of the ideas in it. It concerns a young woman who's found dead in her flat on Guy Fawkes night, or rather the morning after. And Guy Fawkes, if you're not familiar, is kind of a celebration in England where they're commemorating the attempted explosion of the Houses of Parliament. And during that night, people are lighting off fireworks, and so Jap remarks to Poirot that it would be a great night for a murder because with all the fireworks going off, you wouldn't hear a gun going off. And that's exactly what does happen. A woman's body is found the next day by her flatmate, and she's found with a gun in her hand, but it's in her, I believe it's in her right hand, and she's left-handed. And there's an ashtray full of cigarettes, Turkish cigarettes, and yet a room that doesn't smell musty at all, leading Poirot and Jap to really question what's going on in this story. The Incredible Theft involves a weekend house party and the theft of kind of a secret new design for a bomber that's part of the British military, and there's a possibility of it being stolen to be sold to a foreign country. And this one is a pretty standard Christie. I didn't really like it as well because it felt like it could have been dealt with in the length of her normal short stories, and yet it kind of carried on for a long time, so it wasn't my favorite. The third story in the collection, Dead Man's Mirror, is probably one of the more interesting stories in the collection, and it involves a man who invites Poirot down for dinner at his house, and he's a man who's very kind of persnickety about things, and he expects everyone to be on time for dinner. The dinner gong goes off, and everyone assembles, but he's not there. They go to his study, they try the door, it's locked. They keep rattling the door. Finally, they break it in, and they find him slumped over on his desk, dead. He's been shot through the head, and behind him, this mirror is shattered, and shards all over the place. And on the desk is simply written a note that says sorry. So Poirot has to investigate this apparent suicide that could be murder. And one of the interesting things that are connections with this story is the fact that Poirot looks at the shards and comments on, or quotes rather, Lord Tennyson's poem, The Lady of Shalott. He says, the mirror cracked from side to side, the curse has come upon me, cried the Lady of Shalott, which of course is going to create the framework for a later novel, a Miss Marple novel, in fact, called The Mirror Cracked. And Poirot talks about how really a cracked mirror can be kind of a symbol for how people view a person. We see these shards, and then in talking to all of the people involved in this case, we get a different picture or a different impression, a slightly different angle of this person. The murder itself, the solution to it rather, is pretty ingenious. Now, the last story and the shortest one in the collection is Triangle of Rhodes. It's my personal favorite of the collection. The triangle, of course, refers to an eternal triangle that Poirot draws in the sand more than once, and that is the love triangle that so often crops up in stories and in life. We've got a young, beautiful woman named Valentine and her kind of big brute of a husband in Rhodes, on the island of Rhodes for a vacation where Poirot is. And then you've got another couple called the Golds, and Mr. Gold is apparently just completely enamored by Valentine, and so you start to see this triangle developing. And there's a young woman named Pamela who's really interested in what's happening. She just takes an active interest in everyone else's business, and she's with Poirot, kind of talking through everything with him. The story comes to a head when everyone's gathered for cocktails, and Valentine's husband gives her his pink gin. She drinks it, and it's poisoned. And the thought is that Gold was attempting to poison Valentine's husband so he could have Valentine all to himself. And so we have a really interesting story here that wraps up rather quickly, but it's a very nice, tight story, and I think it really shows that Christie is, as far as short stories go, she's a little more in her element with the shorter short story rather than the novella or a long short story form. So as far as this collection goes, I would give it probably a 3. As far as the individual stories go, I think that the Triangle at Rhodes is a very strong one. I would give that probably a 4.5, and I would next give Dead Man's Mirror probably a 4. Incredible Theft I'd give probably 2.75, something like that, and Murder in the Mews is probably a 4 as well. But overall, the collection didn't really hold well together for me. One interesting note is we do see a reoccurrence of Poirot's butler, George. He just makes a very brief appearance, and he'll become more important in later novels. The next read that I'm working on is Dumb Witness, and this is a picture of Agatha Christie's own dog, who she was very fond of and had modeled for the cover of the book. So that's what I'll be talking about.